like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time anyway.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Very well. Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, so this is, I don't want to say unplanned, but we moved things around a little bit. We were initially going to talk about the West Memphis 3, resume our series on occultism. But obviously we've done, now 2 in a row on the Blade Runner franchise. And for Christmas, you very kindly sent me a copy of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Obviously the source material for those films. And I burned through it really quickly. I enjoyed the book a lot. And I figured, you know what? Let's continue our series, get it all done at once, and discuss the book. It's a pretty easy read. It's maybe 200 pages. It's something you can get through quickly. It is very different than the films. There's a lot of crossover. And if you've seen the films, there are things you will understand about the book. The main characters are largely the same. But it is a complement piece. It is different enough to be well worth reading. And I haven't read a lot of Dick stuff, but he's obviously a master of the genre. So I'm curious, Thomas, I'll let you introduce this. When did you first read it, and what sort of grabbed you about it?
I first read it, well, as I think I mentioned, I got turned on to the film Blade Runner early on because very early cable, I'm talking even before cable as we know it existed, the Chicago market was served by what was called On TV. It was quite literally just one channel. And they'd play blocks of music videos sometimes. Other times they'd play cooking shows or fishing shows. Then at night they'd play movies. And Blade Runner was one of the consistent films on offer. And my mom was a huge fan of it. So I was always into it as an IP. And then when I got into science fiction as an adolescent, 12, 13, 14 years old, I was reading a bunch of Harlan Ellison. And I got the paperback compilation Dark Visions. And in the back, there was an advertisement for other paperbacks, including Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was then the paperback was being sold as Blade Runner. So I'm like, oh, wow, the source material. So I went out and I found it, I think, at Crown Books. And it made a big impact on me. And like I said, Philip K. Dick's unusual because he's hard to categorize. I mean, obviously he was a science fiction author, but not in the sense that Arthur C. Clarke was. I invoke Clarke because Clarke was more into metaphysics and theological postulates and questions. But at the same time, he very much had hard sci-fi aspects, to his writing. And, Philip K. Dick, he wasn't like Frank Herbert. He wasn't dealing with paradigmatic systems as his subject matter. Socio-political phenomena at scale was absolutely a framing device and essentially was world building. But Philip K. Dick's, his narratives and his stories, it's about they raise existential questions and ontological questions about the individual and the individual mind amidst disruptive aspects of modernity. And that's the strength of stuff like A Scanner Darkly and Do Androids Dream. That's one of the reasons it's relatable, because it's describing and depicting phenomena that the reader experiences in his own life, because these things are intrinsic to late modernity. When I say late modernity, I'm speaking in Hegelian terms, not Marxian ones, just to be clear. And future shock is a real thing. And a lot's been written about future shock. The phrase was coined quite literally by Alvin Toffler. He wrote a book titled Future Shock. And there was humanist aspects to his analysis, particularly how marriage patterns and child rearing patterns at scale would shake out, and the implications of the mobility of populations and the sort of tensions that would derive therein, as well as economic phenomena and consumption patterns at scale. And people like C. Wright Mills and Christopher Lasch dealt with that kind of thing too, because it's intrinsic to sociology. But very few people have ever written anything about the phenomena of future shock on the discrete individual mind, particularly situated in what's obviously an American context. Or if it's been attempted, it takes the form of satire, like Kurt Vonnegut type stuff. So The Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, it was a very unique book for that reason. I can't remember who wrote it. I think a senior moment, but the book, The Star Is My Destination, I'm not a huge fan of that book, but it was hugely influential and impactful. Arguably, it's subjectively in the same conceptual vein, but it's too fantastical. Do Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, it's not really fantastical at all. In a lot of ways, it came true. That's and there's subtleties to it as well. That I think are adjacent and related to the primary topical thrust, but that raise interesting questions in their own right, especially how the United States and the Soviet Union collaborate on matters relating to replicants. Deckard runs across one of the renegade Nexus 6 who's posing as a KGB officer who's a Blade Runner. Because that's liaising with KGB Blade Runners is not unusual for a big city American cop who deals in the same grim professional duties. And that kind of interplay between integral matters of technology, particularly technology that's purposed for warfare and violence at scale, even, or perhaps especially at times, of heightened tension. Like that was a peculiar but unsurprising aspect of the Cold War. And that's something that's very much related to technology. It's not intrinsic to conflict paradigms. It's just one example of what I was talking about. But it's also the ethical aspects, the humanist aspects of technological civilization. They're not generally addressed in the same capacities that Philip K. Dick deals with them, and that's very insightful. The criteria of what constitutes a human being becoming splendidly arbitrary. Obviously there's a there's all manner of there's all manner of counterfactuals that are kind of on the nose and driving home some egalitarian message and what have you. But and the way they deal with subjective concepts of like in groups and out groups and how such things are determined in political capacities, it tends to be very simple minded, as most moralizing narratives are. But Philip K. Dick's not approaching it like that. I mean, obviously, there's a strongly ethical component to the manner in which replicants are treated because they are a slave caste. But that's not the primary impetus for why they're disqualified as human beings. It's because if everybody is human, then nobody is really. If life forms that can be manufactured are as human as ones who are born of a woman's womb, that kind of neutralizes all epistemic priors about the human condition and what's unique about human beings, even if you're not religiously minded, even if you're a secularist. And that causes this sort of spiraling nihilism. And it also has a tendency to compromise all their ethical structures. So it's essential that this criteria be maintained. It's not just some pretext, to rationalize why these life forms are forced to serve on death squads off world or be prostitutes or work in lead lives of endless toil and pain. Obviously, that's an aggravating factor that diminishes the potentiality of replicants realizing any sort of liberation or being afforded full agency as human beings, but it's not the primary catalyst. And if there's that kind of nihilistic spiral, the center cannot hold. Things fall apart, quite literally, systemically. That's really, and this is very much on people's minds owing to the Cold War as well, because when there's a kind of there's a kind of dialectical agonism that leads to more like profound philosophical activity when there's quite literally systems competing for supremacy over this planet and over human affairs. And the subject matter was the dignity of the human being. If you accept that, the Cold War primarily was in dialectical terms a confrontation between progressives and left aliens who have very different ideas on the historical process as well as the human condition. But the point being that this constant discussion of how to mitigate alienation amidst not just the dehumanization of labor and patterns of life that surround labor but also the proverbial death of God, which in the 20th century was taken for granted by intellectuals and political theorists alike. That becomes all the more of a existential moral hazard writ large. And it's not as if these things have abated or left us since the onset of globalism and the defeat of the communists. But it's the character of the dialectical process has changed a bit because there's not that agonistic catalyst, if that makes any sense. But so it's both the book's both a period piece as well as as well as a highly conceptual sci-fi novella that remains relevant in discrete ways. I think that's the real strength of it. And like before we went live, the big difference is it deals with religious belief, or Aristotle's religious belief. Like, for those who haven't read the story, there's this sort of, he's both a messianic figure, but he's also kind of like Billy Graham. He's like this media personality named Wilbur Mercer. And in the world of Blade Runner and the novel, there's this entire mythology around him and this whole redemption narrative about, the moral integrity of the human being and human agency therein, which, sets man apart and allows for the possibility of salvation. And Deckard develops a certain fascination with this belief system as the story goes on. And the critics of Mercer, as well as the liberationist minded replicants, claim that Mercer's not even a real person. He's either an actor who's playing this character with this entirely imaginary biography, or he's some sort of projected AI or a hologram or something. And it raises the question too, if messianism or true theological commitments are even possible if things are discussed in these terms. If there's a presumption of all human experiences being potentially simulated, psychological experiences, the very fact of that potentiality, it might, itself neutralize the potential for authentic spiritual life. Once, in other words, there's a categorical emphasis or fixation on authenticity, that means that God is already dead, at least in terms of precedent and religious belief and things. So there's a lot packed into that 200 pages. That's that's the best place to start, I'd say.
Yeah, so the opening to this book, we get kind of off the bat a number of key differences. So one, Deckard is married. One,
And that's key to the
Mercerism,
story, yeah.
it is. And we see the introduction of two things very quickly. One, the so-called mood organ, right, which is a device that allows users to, from apparently thousands of combinations, finely tune their own mood synthetically. So for instance, when this starts off, they're arguing. And part of the reason they're arguing is that his wife has sort of voluntarily plunged herself into depression. This is something she's been more and more drawn to. And in the course of the two arguing, he's constantly telling her, well, why are you even doing this? This is stupid. Just make yourself in a good mood. Also, we get introduced to, as you've said, Mercerism. The religious right in Mercerism is the empathy box, where seemingly all humans across the solar system, both on Earth and on, the Martian colonies, have this sort of psychic communion where they become part of sort of the martyrdom of Mercer, right? It's this repeated motif of him walking up a hill while being struck with stones. We learn that this experience is emotionally intense, that old people occasionally die involved in it. But there are several things there. One, because this is a world after a nuclear apocalypse, the condition of the Earth is even worse than the movies, possibly. Effectively, anyone who can get off planet has. The world is just bathed in radioactive ash, and so it is physically difficult to remain on Earth. Deckard, for example, wears a lead-lined codpiece so that he can potentially bear children. We also learn that this level of radiation has produced what they call specials. There's different varieties, ant heads, chicken heads, basically people who have been mutated. One of our main characters, in fact, is mutated. His brain is gone. He was at one point a talented mechanic, and now they just sort of keep him around. But also, one of the interesting things about Mercerism is an extreme attachment, sort of an emotional, spiritual level, to animals. Many animals have been driven extinct by this nuclear war, and so everyone wants to have one. This is a major status game. And so after this fight with his wife, he goes up to the roof to talk with his neighbors. His neighbor has a mare, which is extraordinarily expensive. This mare is, genetically notable, and she has a foal, right, which is going to be both extremely socially and monetarily beneficial to this man. While Deckard, he has, as the title of the book says, an electric sheep, a very convincing but still mechanical replica of a real animal. We learn that this is sort of shameful. It's sort of looked down on, having an imitation animal, and their whole system set up so that no one else knows. For instance, a large part of the plot is driven forward by electric animal repairmen, and the whole thing is set up to look like a veterinary hospital. Obviously, again, in this world where animals are very rare and valuable, they're often stolen, or there's a lot of money to be made. So we learn a couple things there. One, that attachment to animals, which is a central driving sort of thrust into this plot. Just kind of going through
there's a performative empathy to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yes.
That's important. It's authentic biology, or authentic biology is fetishized, but having an animal that one is attached to and that you care for, that's part of the fixation on performative empathy, and that's really what underlies Mercerism as practice. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, exactly. And we see another kind of constant I think it's called, it's English's Animal Handbook, which is this sort of constantly published, I guess you could say sort of like market watch of animals that indicates, their prices, which are many, many times normal person's salary, but also, right, the status of if these animals, are extinct or not. The inciting push to this is very similar to the film. There's a group of Nexus 6 androids, some of the most advanced ever developed, that have made their way to Earth. There's a discussion with the police chief, who's played very differently in this book than he is in the film, where they go through, talking about, the Voight-Comp test, right? The way that they determine if someone is human or an android. They go to Seattle, right, to the corporation, where he meets Rachel Rosen, who you may remember from the film. This is slightly different. It's sort of a similar hook, where the Rosen Corporation is, obviously, they want to stay ahead of the detection technology for obvious reasons. And we learn a couple things. One, the Voight-Comp test doesn't work on human, either schizophrenics or psychopaths. So they begin to inject some doubt. Have you ever retired a human? There are humans who are, fully biological, but lack empathy. Effectively, the Voight-Comp test is a test for empathy. And what's interesting is that, very similarly to the movie, right, there's a moment where he tests Rachel. But what's interesting in this case is the first time he doesn't catch her. He goes through, and when he gets a reading, they say, "Oh, we got you. We've got this on camera. She's just a schizophrenic, or she's a psychopath." I can't remember. They have some explanation for it. And they're literally leaning on him. They try to bribe him with an owl, the same motif you'll note from the film. And then he figures her out very narrowly. He discovers, oh, wait, you actually are an android. And so the relationship between Deckard and the corporation is different between the films, but also his relationship to Rachel is very different. Rachel is much less of a sympathetic character in the book instead of the film. So he goes to, meet the first android, and this android is apparently posing as a KGB official, right? A Blade Runner from the Soviet Union, here obviously to see one of the first retirements of a Nexus 6, this new advanced android. Unbeknownst to Deckard, at least initially, this is the android in disguise. He tries to kill him. Deckard narrowly, retires him. And then I can't remember if it's right before or right after, Rachel calls him and basically says, "You have to bring me on the next one. I want to be a part of this." I'm going over this quickly because I want to get to the introduction of, I think, perhaps one of the most interesting characters. In the background, at the same time, this is sort of the B plot. Isidore, who is this, formerly intelligent mechanic who has become special due to radiation exposure, has met Pris, one of the escaped androids. We don't know yet. Interesting thing about the difference in how androids are portrayed in this is they are much more sinister in the book than in the film.
Oh, yeah.
It is very clear that these androids do not have empathy. And the way this is shown with how Pris is introduced is that, again, much like the film, this is a depopulated Earth. And so even in the city center, apartments are scarcely full. And there's these constant references to the fact that the Earth is covered in junk, that there's other people's items, their family photos, their furniture, all decaying around everyone. And so people live in largely empty apartments. His character Isidore works at this animal repair facility, and he runs into Pris. He's simple-minded. He lives by himself. He's very lonely. But when he encounters her, she's naked to the waist, but has no sort of shame or shock about that whatsoever. Described very alien, and even in the ways that she interacts with him. She lies to his face constantly, clearly taking advantage of him without really a second thought. There is no empathy in the way that she interacts with this simple-minded man who clearly is lonely. And that's sort of the B plot going on in the background. And I'm skipping over a lot here, not because it's not important, but just because there's a character that I want to talk about because he's, in my mind, perhaps the most interesting part of this. So Deckard goes on to sort of the next bounty he has to collect, which is this android who is serving as an opera singer. She's described as, very talented, sort of hiding in plain sight. But when he goes into her dressing room, a film or a scene we see sort of echoed in the film. He's arrested. It doesn't go well. She basically says, hey, this pervert's in my room. And an officer comes to arrest him. Now, Deckard works with the police. He doesn't know this officer. They're taking him to a police station he's never heard of, but he goes along with it. And when he arrives there, he realizes that this is sort of a alternate police station run by androids. And when he's there, he meets another Blade Runner, another bounty hunter who is working for these androids. Do you want to speak about this character, Thomas? Because I think that this character is one of the more interesting in the book.
Well, it also, the faux police station, that's the these sorts of intrigues within intrigues. Like, some people view that as a plot device like John le Carré might employ, just put to like a science fiction setting. That's not really what Philip K. Dick is trying to convey. You know, there's that's a recurring theme, not just into Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, but in most of his major works. And it's but that's key too, because Deckard, initially he can't distinguish between not just his fellow humans and replicants, but these are people who are literally masquerading as police officers, and he still can't distinguish between or identify essential characteristics that supposedly distinguishes them. The replicant that he meets is obviously the model for Roy Batty. What's his name in the book? I can't remember.
Oh shoot, I can't remember. Let me pull up.
Yeah, do so. It's been a minute since I read the book.
Oh, Garland. That's who it is. Garland.
Yeah. It it's but Garland too. I mean, your point. Garland's a lot more of a sinister character than Roy Batty is. I mean, Batty's also both tragic and advanced as he is. The Batty character in the movie, there's this childlike naivete to him. Garland isn't like that at all. And he embodies more human than human in a way that is deliberately ironic, I think. But
so yeah, when they're at this police station, Deckard sort of realizes the game when he meets this other human bounty hunter, Phil Resch, Resch. And this is a really fascinating character, as I said before, because he is a psychopath. He has no empathy whatsoever. So the two of them escape together and go back to collect the bounty for this woman, Luba Luft, who is this opera singer. And throughout this interaction, the two of them are talking, and Resch is genuinely wondering, is he human or not?
Right.
Because again, he found out that he was in the company of these androids, that the possibility of synthetic memories being injected into his brain. He doesn't know, for example, because he, on first examination, he's like, oh yeah, I've been working there for years. And then he realizes, wait a minute, I can't have. I've only been here for 2. Yeah. I have all of these artificial memories. So the two of them, again, go to collect this bounty on the opera singer. They meet her in an art museum. And she sort of realizes that the chick is up. But before, she, asks like, oh, can you buy me a copy of this print I'm looking at? Deckard feels bad. He has empathy for androids. This is a major plot point going forward. And Resch has no time for this. He's like, what are you doing? This doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The two of them eliminate her. It's sort of a nasty scene. And afterwards, Deckard basically says, like, all right, like, I'm going to need to, run this test on you to determine if you're human or not. And what's interesting is that Resh is really not bothered by this at all. For instance, he says, like, well, if I'm an android, I'll just kill myself. He says, I'll just hold my breath until I die. I can do that. And it's, again, interesting because Deckard susses him out. He realizes, like, oh, you're human. You're just a monster. And there is a contrast between the two.
Real quick, Deckard's trying to raise the funds that he can buy a real animal for his wife. That's like a key plot point. So he's reluctantly continuing to retire these androids. But yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and that's also a major plot point, right? That he wants to. His wife is despondent, depressed, and we see other instances throughout the book, which I haven't mentioned, primarily through the eyes of the staff at this sort of robot hospital, where people are, bringing in their animals to be worked on. There's a mistake, which is ironic later enough, where a live animal is brought into this robot hospital and killed when Isidore unbeknowingly, basically plugs it into a battery charger and just electrifies this cat, which is obviously a serious situation, but is a little funny.
Yeah.
And so they have this conversation, and Resh, again, is very clear with Deckard. He thinks he is bad at his job because he says, you have developed empathy for particularly female androids. You have this sort of attraction to him. And Rach basically says, like, well, there's only one way to get this out of your system. You need to sleep with one of these androids and then kill her. That's the only way you can do it. And so at this point, right, Deckard's been through, the ringer. He's had a number of kind of, violent experiences. So he goes up, picks up the goat on finance, basically saying, like, well, I'll pay it off on this, and goes back to his wife. His wife is immensely pleased, right? They've got this real animal. She's sort of over the moon, lifted out of her depression. But as Deckard is sort of going off to bed, his boss calls him and says, like, no, you've got to get the remaining androids tonight. In the intervening time, Batty, I think they call her his wife, I can't remember her name in this, have met up with Triss at Isidore's home. They've sort of prepared the place for a final battle. We're starting to see more and more this dynamic with them sort of talking down to Isidore. And throughout the whole thing, there's been this recurring character of Buster Friendly, who's this sort of like jocular, like comedy host who is on the radio, 23 hours a day, got this revolving cast of characters, perfectly funny, always ready with a quip. And the whole time he has been teasing this big reveal. We're going to let everyone know with this big, journalism expose. And so the action is sort of building to a crescendo. Deckard realizes, all right, I've got to, retire these 3 androids. I'm already worn down. This might well be fatal. And at the same time, we're building to this crescendo, this big, obviously fight, but also this huge, reveal, what is going to be revealed. So he calls Rachel, and Rachel has said, I want to be there. I will help you. He's sort of rebuffed her, and the two meet up at a hotel room initially to discuss, the sort of mission, but the two of them end up going to bed together. We get a couple things here. One, this is described in sort of very clinical, inhuman terms. She is not human, despite the fact that obviously they're capable of this act together. So I'm curious, Thomas, what do you make of that scene, the one between him and Rachel? Because there's a lot there, the two of them talking one to another.
Philip K. Dick was very... The way he describes sex, not just in Do Androids Dream, but in other contexts as well, it's like people colliding without intimacy. And that's key to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Because again, it's it's another aspect of performative sociality. And there's it reminded me a lot of Crimes of the Future, which is a Cronenberg movie that I highly recommend. Where, not to digress too much, but the protagonist in that, this Viggo Mortensen character, the people have eroticized extreme body modification to the point of where performance artists do things like removing their own organs and things. But there's this one part where like this woman tries to seduce him, and he says, "I'm sorry, I'm not good at the old sex." You know, that's very much a nod to Blade Runner, I think, and that's also one of the things that distinguishes it from the film, because one of the aspects of the film is that there's this incredible, genuine passion that flourishes between Rachel and Deckard, and the source material. Not only is that not present, but it's really a statement on, you know, the fact that intimacy is precluded in this future where there's not real grounding elements to the way humans relate socially. You know, like a prerequisite to intimacy is context, and I think that's the key takeaway, unless I'm like reading too much into things, but that's a I think that's the subtext.
Yeah, there's several things there, right?
Yeah.
For instance, Rachel is both physically and, you know, emotionally very, very cold. Like the way that she is described is not trying to, you know, be over sensational here, is not exactly, like, she's beautiful but not sensual.
Yeah, there's nothing erotic about it.
Right. It's very androgynous. And, you know, this will come back up again later, because one of the things that we find out in this novel is that androids are made by type. You know, they'll have several different variations, but ultimately, you know, there is a type. And we find out later that Rachel and Pris are the same. They look the same. And this is one of the things that Rachel sort of has this crisis about, that, you know, she is simply one of many that come off of an assembly line. She says that she's like a bottle cap, right? Pressed out identically. So when Deckard goes to confront these androids, she's with him in the car. They have sort of an argument, a falling out. He threatens to kill her. And she says, well, you know, I know you can never do it. I've done this with 9 different bounty hunters before. And this sort of sends Deckard into a rage, but he realizes he can't do it. He is too empathetic for her, even in this situation. So he basically tells her, he's like, all right, fine, whatever. I'm retiring after this job. I can't do this anymore. Get out. You know, go back to Seattle and run. Like you'll be able to be free for the remaining, in her case, 2 years of her life.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're seeing the culmination of this big reveal from Buster Friendly, which is, we learned several things, which is, one, he is an android. He's synthetic. So are all the guests on his show. One of the interesting things that Isidore comes up with, and it's funny because you can clearly tell he is a, you know, intelligent man who has been made stupid, right? His memory isn't very good. He described as very foggy, but from his thoughts, we get certain kind of interesting insights. And one of them, because he hears, and I believe it's Isidore, I don't think it's Deckard, although I might be wrong on that, is picking up on the fact that Buster Friendly is constantly denigrating Mercerism, despite the fact that Mercerism is officially recognized by the UN, by both the Soviets and the Americans, as pro-social, right? After, you know, this apocalyptic war. Exactly. It's necessary to have some sort of pro-social force. This has created among humans a sort of synthetic ersatz empathy, right? Killing is extremely stigmatized. Obviously, in the example of animals, one of the tests on the Well, actually, several of the tests on the Voight comp or questions on the Voight comp test are about exactly that. The idea of eating a dog or a leather couch or something like that is to
or not
humans
helping the tortoise. Yeah.
exactly is emotionally shocking. This is something that is simply not done. And he has this great line where he basically says, "I realize that both Mercer and Mercer and this TV host are fighting for control of my brain. These are two kind of totalizing systems, one versus the other, which is interesting both when we look back to, your comments about the Cold War, right? The idea of these two totalizing systems, but also, there really is no freedom. Something will occupy your mind. And so, as we've said before, when, right before this kind of, pinnacle of the action, we see this big expose. The androids and Isidore are kind of, huddled around a television. And it's revealed, according to, to Buddy here, that Mercer is a lie. They've found, allegedly, the actor who played that role, who was captured in, these films, which are, pushed out on the empathy organ. They say that the stones which were thrown at him were styrofoam. They couldn't have possibly hurt him. That this was all made on a soundstage. The moon in this is painted. And so we see that, that idea that the androids are denying this form even of Ursat's religion or Ursat's empathy. And also that sort of war for the soul. I think the symbolism is interesting because in this synthetic memory, when you go through it, you feel sort of the pain in his side, right? Obviously, sort of an echo of the crucifixion when he is struck in his side. So he's depicted with, blood gushing out of his side.
Right.
And so I think that's a fascinating scene. Do you want to speak about that sort of expose, Thomas?
Yeah, well, that's also why too, if you want to, the denouement, where, as it were, where Deckard goes, he goes to the Pacific Northwest, presumably to meditate on these revelations, literally. And I think it's a metaphor for Elijah the prophet who went into the wilderness. That was Elijah, right? Yeah. It's and then when he discovers the frog, which he's convinced that it strikes him because it's so rare to see even little animals that in the wild anymore. And he takes the frog home to his wife, and then they eventually discover that the frog is synthetic, but Deckard's apparently made peace with that. Philip K. Dick's books never resolve in a tight little package conceptually, but I don't think I'm off base. That whole people have already lost their ability to function within the historical environment they're situated in if they've got to constantly vet things that populate their environment for authenticity, or if they've constantly got to try and identify what concepts or what criteria render something conceptually authentic or real. That makes empathy, that those conditions preclude empathy and intimacy and all of these other essentially human things. And the only way out of that nihilistic spiral is to sort of fully embrace that reality, whereby these interstates can flourish again. This is the way I read it. Because that's the key aspect of the existential crisis of the individual in both the movies and in the book is that without these reference points to live historically, people without a past can't orient themselves as any, not just, as a discrete individual distinct from other people and, a human being with agency, but it becomes impossible to value things in any deeply committed way because all emotional responses are merely cultivated around symbolic psychological items that are supposedly universal to human beings and are only aesthetically coded to appeal to whatever individual they're tailored to fascinate, and in acknowledging the irredeemability of the world as it is in Blade Runner, one can access those spiritual, characteristics of the human being again. That's why I think it's profound. I mean, basically, he realizes his wife likes the frog anyway, if I'm remembering right. And that's kind of when he makes peace with things. He's no longer he's no longer disturbed by its inauthenticity. But that's when arbitrary criteria are assigned to qualify or disqualify human beings from their essential humanity, which again is an essential aspect of the social order. It's the only thing that's keeping things from falling apart. That bleeds into all other essentially human activities, emotional, cognitive, and physical as well. And there becomes this confused and desperate effort to identify what is authentic within one's own emotional life. And that's why the characters who are truly sociopathic, they're the ones who are splendidly adapted to that environment. And I mean, that's a commentary to, or a meditation rather, on how corrupting it is to try and curate ethics according to some ideological paradigm, even if it's necessary to sustain systemic features of of the political order or anything else. I mean, even if the intentions behind such things are good, you're doing violence to people's ability to curate within themselves a genuine moral intelligence. I mean, that's obviously a huge, a hugely relevant thing to the. I mean, it's relevant anyway, but it's particularly Cold War coded in temporal terms because that's exactly what the respective regimes, albeit the Second World in a much more brutal and ham-fisted way, but that's what both regimes were very much attempting to do. I'm going to make no mistake, there was an effort to create a new American man and woman as much as there was to create a new Soviet man. It just wasn't characterized that way. And it was more nuanced and there wasn't an American version of the Great Purge or the Arctic death camps or annihilation therapy. So there were still deeply organic and historical tendencies in American life that were competing dialectically for dominance over the official ideology. But I think you know what I mean. Forgive me if that was a bit too...
No, not at all. So obviously Deckard goes to retire these androids, and throughout the kind of last third of the book, we haven't mentioned it, but Deckard is starting to have mystical experiences. He is seeing Mercer before him. And in fact, Mercer warns him, like, oh, they're behind you. And he seemingly without remorse kills Pris, the woman who is, or the android rather, who is physically identical to Rachel. They look exactly the same. He has this interesting interaction with Isidore, where he tells him, I'm here. Isidore, remarks sort of internally, of course, that Deckard doesn't look anything like he thought. He's just kind of this small, schlubby guy who's doing this, dirty job, seemingly, very beaten down. And again, part of the reason that Isidore has run out is that in this apartment, while he's looking for supplies, he discovers a spider, right? A genuine biological spider.
Right.
And the androids have no empathy for this. Pris pulls its legs off, literally, because she says, it can walk just as well on 4 as it does on 8. It'll probably die anyway. And of course, Isidore is horrified by this. And we see again that lack of empathy when Deckard goes to the door. And he, not even particularly convincingly, pretends to be Isidore. But they can't tell the difference.
Right.
To them, what is there between them? He busts down the door and kills them. Batty is much less a character in the novel than he is in the movie. He's I think in the book he's a field hand. He's not even necessarily this great leader. Although we hear a little bit that he was experimenting with psychedelics and with religion to try and create empathy within his his followers. What's particularly interesting is that there's a discussion, I believe, just before this, at the kind of right before the climax of the book, where they talk about empathy. And when it is revealed, at least allegedly, that Mercer is a fake, they say, "Oh, you always hold this over us. You say that empathy is what makes you human, you make it better, but apparently that's all fake. Apparently that is simply synthetic." Which again, looking to the fact that Friendly is an android, there's sort of an open question there. But afterwards, right, and this is shortly before his trip to the Pacific Northwest, we learn a couple things, which is one, Deckard is almost completely broken. He is having a hard time relaying this mystical experience he has with Mercer. He claims to be Mercer.
Yeah, he starts believing he may very well be he himself is Wilbur Mercer.
Yes, and his superiors kind of, shrug it off. But after he finds this toad, he has this experience out in the wilderness. He learns that this goat, this extremely expensive thing he has purchased, has been killed. Hasn't gotten sick where he could use the warranty to exchange it for another one. But Rachel, before she fled town, came to his house and killed his goat.
Right.
There's an element of jealousy, perhaps, because in their interactions, she talks about the difference between what they are doing and then his relationship to his wife, where is a possibility of giving birth and producing children. We also see a little bit of the fact that these androids basically are psychopaths. They have no regard for anyone else. And so, as you've said, the action closes with Deckard sort of asleep on the couch after Iran, his wife, has discovered that this toad is synthetic. And there is that sort of, making peace with synthetic life. And I think that that's a very, interesting point because, on one hand, we have seen Deckard, sort of shed his empathy, right? He was able to kill Pris with, without a second thought, really, at least initially, that didn't bother him. And again, we see him sort of adapting to this new world, as you've said, that psychopathy, and Deckard, I don't think, becomes a full, psychopath like the other Blade Runner. But it is this sort of interesting, making peace with the world you find yourself in. to kind of close my remarks on it, this book is very, very good. There's a lot that we weren't able to get into because even though it's a short novel, it's very philosophically dense, and there's only so much you can say in an hour. I don't want to say we've spoiled it because look, it's the movies. The movies spoil the book. Spoilers don't even matter to a novel that's good enough, which this is. But there's a lot in there, both about the kind of, as you've said, the creation of new men during the Cold War, and also the same kind of ruminations on empathy, what it is to be human. I will say, for my money, this is not to say that the book is bad by any means. I think that the movies are more interesting than the book. It's sort of a tighter, more refined vision. It's personal preference. It's still well worth your time, particularly if you're interested in, science fiction. But those are sort of my, very broad thoughts on it. And it's a very neat complement piece to the other two films. And, taken as a sort of a loose trilogy between the three of them, there's a lot to gather from, this novel as well as the two films.
Yeah, I agree very much. And yeah, I think the films are superior, but it's essential reading, I think, if you're a fan of the film, or the IP generally. And Philip K. Dick's a difficult author, right? I realize he's got a very dedicated fandom, and I think he was definitely a serious individual, but his stuff is not for everybody, and it can be difficult.
Yeah, my brother-in-law is a big fan of his, and he read recently and was a very big fan of the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch.
Yeah, okay.
Which, from his review, sounds very good. So who knows? I may drag you back after we've knocked out a few more of these these occultism episodes to talk about science fiction again. So as far as links, obviously you guys know where to find Thomas. I'll have his website, his Substack, as well as a few other things down in the description where you can find him. I think, like many people, Thomas, getting very excited for your long form. I think that I don't want to speak out of turn, but I may be getting an early draft, which I'm excited to go over. Obviously, there's a lot in that, and whenever it comes out, we'll be pointing people in that direction. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. If you want to support me, and this is what I do, you can throw me a few bucks a month on Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad. You get the episodes early and ad-free. I know the ads are irritating, but look, I got to pay my mortgage somehow, and that way you can get the content a little bit earlier without those irritating ads. And the value proposition is pretty decent. It's like 22, 23 cents an episode, less if you want to view it as hours of content. So you're welcome. And yeah, guys, in all seriousness, I do appreciate you supporting me. Also, check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. I use their workouts 3-4 days a week. As far as things I recommend, this is something that I use. It's part of my daily life. And JD is a very, very talented guy, good at what he does. Again, Thomas, man, thank you so much. This was a great time.
Thank you, my friend.
To everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.